If you're in Israel, I guess it's Laila Tov, Erev Tov. Actually,
Laila Tov. Good evening.
Laila Tov, exactly, Yaakov. Thank you. Well, thanks for being here, everybody. We're about to start right now. We always begin with Hatikva, and that's where we shall begin now.
התקווה.
המסדר ידגל את נשקו. דגל, שק!
We left off last week talking about Yitzchak Shamir and Avraham Stern as we moved over to the Lechi, Lochamei Cherut Yisrael, the freedom fighters for Israel, what the British called the Stern Gang. And we continue from there. This again was Avraham Stern. And it was he who was the founder of the Lechi. And we learned about him. We learned about how he gave his life. Truly, at one point, he was so incredibly wanted, dead or alive, by the British. He was running from building to building, sleeping somewhere else every night. And finally, the British found him in an apartment. They got everyone else out of the apartment. They handcuffed him and they shot him in the back and they killed him. And he was succeeded by Yitzchak Shamir. Shamir was one of three. There was also Natan Yellen Moore and a third person, Israel Eldad, and they became the new leaders. So we spoke at the end of class last week about Yair, Avram Stern. And this is the building we pointed out where he was murdered. It now is a museum in Israel. And that's a plaque in memory of him. That's Yair. Many of these people had battle names, nom de guerre, battle warrior names that were different from their actual names. And so he was known as Yair, is who Avraham Stern. Okay. And we left off, we were getting into Yitzchak Shamir. Now, in getting into Shamir, I remind you, first of all, we'll get back to that in a second. It's important to understand about Shamir. We're going to go to those two songs in a moment. We learned about Shamir that as a youth, he joined Beitar. And you may or may not remember this, but Menachem Begin had joined Beitar. Menachem Begin had joined Beitar in Poland. Yitzchak Shamir, he had joined Beitar in Bialystok in Russia. Beitar was an international youth movement of people in their teens and their early 20s, founded by Jabotinsky, about whom we've learned a great deal. And the movement was based on the principles of Jabotinsky and trained young people in those principles of hadar, having pride. This was a time in the 1930s and 40s when Jews internationally were spit on. We were the symbol of persecution, just as in the biblical times. If you asked somebody, almost to use an expression or an idiom, if you were to say, like, what picture do they have in a dictionary for the word persecuted, it would be a picture of a Jew. Jews were being wiped out slowly, methodically in Europe, and the world didn't come to our rescue. America under Franklin Roosevelt locked its doors and did not act for Jews. Roosevelt turned down many different opportunities to bomb the Nazi rail lines linked to concentration camps like Auschwitz. American fighter pilots actually flew over those rail lines, but because the orders were not to bomb them, they did not bomb them. Roosevelt did not allow Jews into the country, Jews who had gotten out of Europe. America had quotas, immigration quotas, and in no year during Roosevelt's presidency were the quotas ever filled completely. So Jews did get in, but most were turned away. And even with available slots under the quotas, only later in time were his records, Roosevelt's own records and letters and private writings found in his museum. Man was an anti-Semite. England had Haifa closed down as well. And so Jews were just the dirt of the earth. And that's one of the main reasons American Jews did so little during the Holocaust on behalf of Jews overseas, because American Jews were very, very insecure and afraid it would happen to them next if they got out of line. And Jabotinsky said and taught young people, you have nothing to be ashamed of. You should be proud. You're the children of King David. That's your dynasty. You're from that dynasty. He was not a religious man, Jabotinsky, or he would have taught, you're Mamlechet Kohanim. You're a kingdom of Kohanim, of God's ministers. You're a chosen people. But Jabotinsky found a secular kind of language, and the people who became the Irgun and the Lechi grew up in Beitar. And they grew up, Jabotinsky understood the importance of an anthem, of a song that kids would grow up and would sing that song, and it would become ingrained in them, the values. And again, we've played it once before, and I'm going to play it for you again now. This time I've got the words. I prepared the words last night. Denise was very kind and let me just take an hour out of our plans last night to put the words together. Here we go. over there. The last moment they have recognized. So that was one of Jabotinsky's two anthems. And the other anthem, which becomes very important as we continue today, is to refresh our memory, never to forget that all of Israel was supposed to include what it is today and land east of the Jordan River. When Arabs in the United States State Department and others talk about that Israel should give up the so-called West Bank, Judea, Samaria, that territory west of the Jordan River, here's the Jordan River, this is the line of the Sea of Galilee or the Kinneret Lake, the Jordan River and the sea and the Dead Sea, all of it west of that, which includes the so-called West Bank, Judea, Samaria, that was supposed to be part of Israel, and this was the Palestine Mandate. Remember, in fact, that became, as the British slowly but surely tore off Eretz Yisrael from the original Palestine Mandate, and then gave all of that, what's in yellow here, to the Arabs and made a country of Jordan, leaving us only with the purple, which includes, once again, Judea, Samaria, the so-called West Bank. And then they further took this purple area and they tore it to the point that Israel was left only with the orange. At the time of the War of Independence, the yellow, that's Judea, Samaria, what the Arabs call the West Bank, and most of the Galilee, Gaza Strip, part of the Negev, Sinai, they tore that away also. Israel was left with an incredibly small country. And therefore, the Irgun, its logo, its emblem, was the original Palestine Mandate, with the Jordan River really kind of in the center, even to the left of the center, to the west. And Jabotinsky wrote an anthem, Shtei Gadot, the song that affirmed that there are two sides to the Jordan River, and this side is ours, and so is that. Shtei Gadot la Yarden, Zu Shalanu Zu Gam Kain. That's the other one we'll start with this morning, or evening, depending on where you are. Let's here, let me just get it going and I'll put the words on the screen. Okay.
זו שלנו, כן, שתי גדול
Now, in this next clip, we learned last week about the assassination of Lord Moyne. That was one of the main things that distinguished the Lechi from the Irgun. The Lechi believed in assassinating key figures. In fact, when the police officer who you may recall what I told you about Shamir becomes, first we learned about Shamir that he grew up in Beitar, studied law. We learned that his family was murdered during the Holocaust, that his father was killed by people that the father grew up with as friends, non-Jews, who then, when the tide turned against Jews, they murdered Shamir's father, and his mother and sister were murdered in the concentration camps. And we continued and we talked about Shamir being involved in the Lechi, that the British arrested him and he hid under a stack of mattresses in a warehouse and broke out of the prison. He continually broke out of prisons. No prison could hold him. He escaped through a barbed wire fence. Then we talked about that he was involved in determining that they had to assassinate Lord Moyne, who was Britain's Minister for Middle Eastern Affairs, based in Cairo, in charge of all of England's Middle Eastern properties, what became Jordan, Palestine, Egypt, and the Lechi decided, this guy is the one who gave the orders that the Patria could not dock in Haifa, which led to the deaths of hundreds. And this guy is the one who's not letting Jews in. And effectively, Jews are going back to Europe to die under Hitler after having gotten out. He's got to be killed. This policy has to stop. Shamir personally ordered the assassination and personally picked the two guys who did it. National heroes in Israel now, unknown by most people to this day, Eliyahu Hakim and Eliyahu Beit Suri. And then we learned about the officer Martin, T.G. Martin, who recognized Shamir by his bushy eyebrows. Shamir had to go everywhere in disguise because his photo was everywhere up there, wanted. As a result, he actually, for a period of time, masqueraded or dressed as a rabbi, just as Begin had done. It was a popular way to kind of hide yourself as an Orthodox rabbi with a black hat and a long beard and payas and and tzitzis and everything. And you didn't look as much like the guy on the poster. But Shamir had these big bushy eyebrows. And so Officer T.G. Martin arrested him. He was able to, and for that, the Lechi, which assassinated other people anyway, immediately marked Martin for assassination, and they killed him. They tracked down that officer who arrested Shamir, and they killed him. Shamir ended up this time being taken off to a prison in Africa because he continually had been getting out of prisons. So they put him in Eritrea, and even then he was able to, with 4 other Irgun members, break out of that prison. They dug a 200-foot long tunnel, and he was in an oil truck for 3 days before the Lechi sent him a passport. And that's kind of where we left off. I wanted to find for you a picture so you could better appreciate Shamir's bushy eyebrows. So I started looking for one. This is the original wanted poster throughout Israel. Mishteret Palestine Veered Eretz Yisrael. The Palestine government, prasim, literally means gifts, but basically prize. This is a reward. Let's call it reward. Reward. Mimshalat haaretz tishalem et haprasim kildil kaman. Chelef idiot hameviot. Can't make out that word. Bekesher lema'asaro shel kol echad misheshet chavrei kvutzat Stern. Reward. The government of the land will pay rewards as below in return for information that leads to the arrest of each of these 6 members of the Stern group, Hakorim la'atzmam Lochamei Cherut Yisrael, who call themselves Lechi. And they had Natan Friedman Yellen, one of the 3 commanders, Yitzchak Yizernetsky, that's Shamir, and Yaakov Levstein. Ironically, crazy is that they were offering 500 lirot, 500 Israeli pounds for Friedman Yellen and for Levstein, and only 200 for Shamir, which probably got him even more insulted. And at the time, Shamir was 29 years old. So I was looking for some pictures. So that's those bushy eyebrows. This is Shamir many, many years later as Prime Minister of Israel. And eventually an Israeli postage stamp honoring his memory. And last week we also saw a Torah, a Haganah Sefer Torah, a Torah scroll that was donated to an orphanage in memory of both Avram Stern and Yitzchak Shamir. But I was looking for a picture that really would pick up on his bushy eyebrows, and I found two pictures. These are bushy eyebrows, but they're a little wider. But now, there's a picture. That's Shamir with his bushy eyebrows. That's what Officer Martin was able to spot. And then I found one other picture of Shamir I thought I would show you also. This is going to be a little harder to focus on Shamir because of the very handsome, or some would just say adorably cute, Orthodox rabbi that he's meeting with at the time. That's a picture of Shamir in 1985. Again, you could see the eyebrows. And while we're talking about this guy, I found a picture of this guy back in 1985 with an up-and-coming Israeli emissary, Benjamin Netanyahu. At the time, I think Netanyahu was Israel's UN ambassador. And this is a picture of the same rabbi with an up-and-coming young American United States senator from the state of Delaware. I was famous before I came to Irvine. Anyway, so we talked about Lord Moyne and how Lord Moyne was just having a ball in the Middle East, just yachting and jet skiing and whatever through the Mediterranean, having a ball with his little British flag in the background. And the Lechi sent Eliyahu Beit Suri and Eliyahu Hakim to take the smile off his face for good. Country is made of Hakim and Beit Suri, national heroes, with the postage stamps. And after the assassination of Moyne, that's his kid. We went through it last week. That's the museum, that the location where Moyne was assassinated. There's the Lechi assassin in the bushes, shoots Lord Moyne, while the other Lechi member shoots his associate, his aide-de-camp, right in front of his palatial estate in Cairo. After the 1973 Yom Kippur War, as things kind of resolved themselves after the war, and there was a prisoner exchange, Israel demanded, as part of any prison exchange, it would not give up Egyptian prisoners of war unless Egypt agreed finally to hand over the remains of Eliyahu Hakim and Eliyahu Beit Suri, who had been put on trial in Egypt for assassinating Moyne, and their remains had lain buried in Egypt for 30 years until 1975. And I was able to locate this clip of Egypt returning the remains of Eliyahu Hakim and Eliyahu Beit Suri to Israel. Let's take a look. This was part of a United Nations brokered exchange. And this brings us to the assassination of Count Folke Bernadotte. In order to appreciate the assassination of Count Folke Bernadotte, which is probably the most important, or else one of the two most important assassinations by the Lechi, let's go forward and let's understand the background. You've heard this, but it's never quite been presented perhaps the way I put it together for you, so that we can appreciate the importance of why Bernadotte's assassination is one of the most important events in the rise of the state of Israel. And not only one of the most important, but it really helped make it possible for Israel to come into being. In 1947, the United Nations announced a partition plan that further cut Israel down. As you know, we went through it just a few moments ago. The UN partition plan basically left Israel with only the orange. The 1947 UN partition plan left Israel with almost nothing. From what it had once been, to what it next became, to what they now were leaving it. War broke out, and the Arabs did not accept even that. And in the war, the Arabs saw a massive, massive flight of Arabs from the land of Israel. Arabs who were living there, and the Jews were asking them, don't leave. The Arabs fled in the hundreds of thousands for various reasons. Number one, Arab armies that were invading demanded of local Arabs to get out. Get out of our way. We are going to massacre everything and everyone in sight. We're going to destroy everything we see. We're going to drive the Jews into the Mediterranean Sea. If you're there, you're going to get massacred with everyone else, because we're not going to stop and ask who's who. Everyone's going. This is not a regular kind of war you read about in books. We are massacring every single person we find. So hundreds of thousands of Arabs left the land of Israel to get out of the way. Number two, they were promised, if you do get out of the way, in a week or two, we will have massacred all the Jews. When you come back, you can get their property. Not only can you return to your property, you'll get their property. Number three, by massacring, by exodusing, you will be crippling the Israeli economy. It wasn't Israel yet. You'll be crippling the Jewish economy, which all of a sudden 300,000 workers are going to be gone. The economy, it's worse than a boycott. So they left, and they intended to come back. They did not intend for Israel, for the Jews to win the war. And they did not come back, and they're never going to come back. The Arab countries took the position, we're not holding you, we're not keeping you here, you're going back to Israel, or it's going to be an Arab country, Palestine. So we're putting you in refugee camps. And that's gone on since 1948 for 75 years. Those Arabs who fled never were allowed out of refugee camps. And their children and their grandchildren, and that's what you now have in the Gaza and other places. At the same time that was happening, nearly 800,000 Jews were driven out of Arab countries in the area because the Arabs felt these are a fifth column. They're going to be traitors. They're living in our midst, but they'll be loyal to Israel. They expelled some 800,000 Jews, and they seized the property of these Jews. Many of them were upper class and upper middle class. And those Jews fled to Israel. And for those who have studied war, there's a term for it. It's common in war, a population exchange. It's common. If you just, after class, Google population exchange or war population exchange, happens after every major war. And that's what happened here. Arabs left Israel. That's what happened with India and Pakistan. You had Muslims left the areas that became Pakistan, left the areas that became India, and they fled to the areas that became Pakistan. And Hindus that were in the areas that became Pakistan fled to India. Many examples, many examples. And so what happened was the Jews came to Israel and they became those are the Sephardic, that's the core of the Sephardic Jewish population that today is the majority of Israel, 55%, and have built Israel. They were not put by the Jews into refugee camps. They were welcomed and they were integrated into the society. And the Arabs, they did it the other way, refusing to welcome them and instead putting their immigrants into concentration camps and the like. And the result is that now you hear about the Palestinian refugees and demands that Israel should take 3 million because it's the original refugees, children and grandchildren. It's just not going to take them. 3 million Arabs? Crazy? So let's go back to this. Palestinians, and we say Palestinians, we're talking about the Arabs, left their homes for a variety of reasons. Wealthy Arabs left to get out of the way. Arab leaders called on the others to get out of the way. They didn't want to get caught in the crossfire. Had they accepted the UN partition, not a single Arab would have become a refugee. And they would have their so-called Palestine would be a country today. The first to leave were the wealthy ones. But then they all married, one by one, they fled to the Arab countries. The Arabs thought they would win in less than the twinkling of an eye. And it didn't work out that way. Arab leaders provoked the exodus. They were encouraged to leave their homes to make way for the invading armies. The U.S. Consul General in Haifa wrote in 1948 that the local Mufti-dominated Arab leaders were urging all Arabs to leave the city. The Economist, which was actually anti-Israel, wrote in 1948, the most of the 62,000 Arabs who formerly lived in Haifa, not more than 5,000 or 6,000 remained. Various factors influenced the decision to flee. The most potent were announcements made over the air by the higher Arab executive urging Arabs to leave. The magazine, Time magazine, they wrote about the battle for Haifa in May 1948. And they talked about how Arab leaders ordered mass evacuations of the local Arab citizenry. By withdrawing Arab workers, their leaders hoped to paralyze Haifa. The Arab National Committee in Yerushalayim, following instructions of the Arab Higher Committee, ordered women, children, and the elderly in Yerushalayim to leave their homes. Any opposition to this order is an obstacle to the Holy War and will hamper the operations of the fighters in these districts. Who gave the orders? The secretary of the Arab League office in London wrote, the wholesale exodus is due partly to the belief of the Arabs, encouraged by the boastings of an unrealistic Arabic press and the irresponsible utterances of some of the Arab leaders, that it could be only a matter of weeks before the Jews were defeated by the armies of the Arab states and the Palestinian Arabs enabled to re-enter and retake possession of their country. The Syrian prime minister wrote in 48-49, you know, since 1948, we've been demanding the return of the refugees to their homes, but we ourselves are the ones who encouraged them to leave. The refugees were confident their absence would not last long, said Monsignor George Hakim, a Greek Orthodox Catholic bishop of Galilee. Their leaders had promised them the Arab armies would crush the Zionist gangs. And so it was. The Secretary General of the Arab League, Azam Pasha, assured the Arab peoples that the occupation of Palestine and Tel Aviv would be as simple as a military promenade. He pointed out that they were already on the frontiers, so the millions the Jews had spent on land and economic development would be easy booty, for it would be a simple matter to throw Jews into the Mediterranean Sea. So brotherly advice was given to the Arabs of Palestine to leave their land, homes, and property, and to stay temporarily in neighboring fraternal states. So how many left? Arabs claim that 800,000 to 1 million Palestinians became refugees. That's a lie. It's an exaggeration, as with everything they say. The last census taken in 1945 found 756,000 Arab residents, and 2 years later, the total was 809,000. A 49 government of Israel census counted 160,000 Arabs living in the country after the war. So you do the math. If there were 800,000 Arabs living there in November 47 and 160,000 a year and a half later, the most that left was 650,000. Okay, that's not just 5 people on a block. That's a lot of people. But it was a population exchange. There were no more than 650,000 Arabs, not 3 million. That's what they claim now, who could have been refugees. A report by the United Nations mediator on Palestine in 1948 said it was only 360,000. The United States Central Intelligence Agency said it was 330,000. A village-by-village analysis said it was 583 to 609,000. Bottom line, the number of Arab refugees who left in order to paralyze Israel, get out of the way so that the Arab armies could murder and massacre the Jewish population, and they could come back then and take not only their own property back, but the property of the neighbors. It was somewhere between 330 and 650,000 people. While everybody talks about the Palestinian Arab refugees, little is heard about the Jewish refugees from Arab countries. 820,000. Of the 820,000 who left, some ended up in America. Some ended up in France and in other parts of Europe. 586,000 were settled in Israel at great expense. It was a poverty-stricken brand new country. It was a little nothing of a country the size of New Jersey. They didn't have an army. They were Holocaust survivors. 3 years ago, the people who created the country 3 years ago had been in Dachau. I mean, you had people who came from Tsarist Russia, farmers building the Negev. They had no money, but they took them in. The Arab countries never offered any compensation, confiscated their businesses and property. Israel has said consistently, we're never going to let those Arabs back in the country. That's never happening. Even the left-wing Israeli parties, except the extreme left, they know that's suicide to take 3 million Arabs in. As far as they want compensation, if they want compensation for what they left behind, let's talk about compensation for what the Jews left behind. Once we compare the numbers, we're sure the Arabs are going to leave the table. So I've read for you a whole number of quotes that have been published on the internet. How the Mufti, for example, the Cairo Daily Akhbar El Yom wrote that the Mufti on May 15th, the day Israel was declared independent, the Mufti of Jerusalem appealed to the Arabs of Palestine to leave because the Arab armies were about to enter and fight. And there are individuals, Newsweek, never pro-Israel in the time, spoke about, they sent someone who was interviewing Arabs still living in Israel, and they recalled being urged to evacuate. That's who told them to leave. And they left on the assumption that they would return even after a few hours. They told us the Jews attacked our region, better to evacuate the village, return after the battle is over. And we fled. Left a fire burning under the pot in the kitchen. We thought we'd be back so soon. We left our sheep and our money and our gold. We expected we'd be back in a few hours. Which brings us to Count Folke Bernadotte. The question is whether Folke Bernadotte was an outright anti-Semite or just like so many Europeans of today who say they're neutral on the Israel-Arab thing and urge a two-state solution give up Judea, Samaria, let in 3 million Arabs because we're your best. The American State Department, you'll hear like American government leaders will say, we're pro-Israel and we're friends. And sometimes friends have to talk harsh truths to their friends. That's what you hear from the State Department. That we care about. That's what we heard from Obama. Oh, I'm a big Zionist. And because I care about Israel, I'm telling Israel things they need to do for their own good. Give up the West Bank, Judea, Samaria. You'll have peace. Give the Arabs a country. Let in the 3 million Arabs, and then you'll have peace. And so Count Volker Bernadotte, this is why he was so dangerous. Count Volker Bernadotte he was Swedish, and he was an international mediator, negotiator. He negotiated his most famous negotiation was with Adolf Hitler. He was sent to negotiate with Adolf Hitler very, very early, before the Holocaust really got rolling, to convince Adolf Hitler to release prisoners in concentration camps. And Count Volker Bernadotte made a name for himself by convincing Hitler to release 30,000 prisoners of the Nazis. That's pretty impressive. Out of those 30,000, just think to yourself, from what you know about the 1940s, think of how many Jews must have been let out if Bernadotte was able to get 30,000 prisoners out of the concentration camps. Just pause a moment, ask yourself, knowing what you know, imagine how many Jews he saved. Out of the 30,000 Nazi prisoners that Bernadotte got out, the number of Jews was 450. 29,550 non-Jews and 450 Jews. That was Count Volker Bernadotte. So now he was sent by the United Nations to negotiate a final agreement with the Jews and the Arabs to create a Jewish and an Arab country. And he came with the following set of proposals. He said, I'm not going to force anything down anybody's throat. I'm just a mediator to bring the sides together. And I'm going to bring a proposal. And I'd like to use this proposal as a basis for negotiating. And then if the sides don't agree, and if nobody can agree, I'm going to go back to New York and the United Nations and recommend that they adopt my proposal. So I'm not going to force my proposal down anyone's throat. But if the parties can't agree on a deal, then I will urge the United Nations to adopt my proposal. What was Count Bernadotte's proposal? First part of his proposal, all 300,000 to 600,000 Arabs who had fled Israel are to be repatriated back to Israel, which immediately kills the state of Israel, immediately kills the new state. All 300,000 come back. Number two, no more Jewish immigration into Israel until things calm down. Number three, the map that the UN already cut down, the city of Jerusalem, including West Jerusalem, Arabs in the final deal, the Arabs get the city of Jerusalem. The Arabs will get the Negev. Haifa Harbor, Haifa will be internationalized. So no one can get into the port unless the whole world agrees, unless international oversight permits it. Lod Airport, what today is Ben Gurion Airport, will be internationalized. Israel never would have come into being. She would have been paralyzed without an airport. You're going to leave it up to the United Nations to decide whether Israel can operate its airport. If Israel's airport was under United Nations control, internationalized, can you imagine? You know the United Nations and Israel. You imagine the United Nations, they closed down the airport. Can you imagine the United Nations at Haifa? Let's go to business here. So Bernadotte saw that he had the authority to create a strong proposal. Under his proposal, Bo te'aved Yisrael tesegeha b'milchemet ha'atzmaut. Israel would have to give up all its gains in the War of Independence. Ba'af yigarach chelka shel hamdina ha'yehudit b'hashva'a l'shetach shehuktzah la b'achlatat ha'chalukah. Israel not only was going to have to give up all her gains during the War of Independence, but even give up more than that. And so he prepared suggestions that Rov HaNegev yimaser la'Aravim, that just about all the Negev would be given to the Arabs. Nemal Haifa u'nemal Hatuvalo yiyu b'shilton ben-lumi. Internationalized Haifa Harbor and Lod Airport. And Yuchseru L'shetach HaYehudi Yuchseru 300,000 Shloshet Mea Elef Plitim Aravim. Yerushalayim Timasel Midnar Aviv. Let's look at it in English. His suggestions included the following. This is a formal United Nations document you're looking at. The mediator advanced the following suggestions as a possible basis for discussion. That the boundaries of the two members, namely what would be called Israel and what he would have had as Palestine, be determined in the first instance by negotiations with the assistance of the mediator, and on the basis of suggestions to be made by him. He wrote this about himself in the third person. It's UN document. Among his proposals, immigrations within its own border should be within the competence of each member. Israel should be able to decide who can immigrate to Israel. That's good. Arabs should be able to decide who can immigrate to Arabs. That's okay. Provided that following a period of 2 years from the establishment of the Union, that is 2 years later after we cut the deal, either member would be entitled to request the Council of the Union to review the immigration policy of the other member. So for 2 years under my proposal, Israel can take in immigration as it likes, but 2 years later, the Arab side can request that the United Nations review the Israel immigration policy and render a ruling. In the event of the inability of the Council to reach a decision, the issue could be referred to either member to the Economic Social Council of the United Nations, whose decision would be binding. So you're back to the British running Palestine. After 2 years under the Confocal-Bernadotte proposal, the Arabs could challenge Israel's immigration policy, bring it to the Council. The Council, if they can't render a ruling that everybody can agree on, would bring it to the United Nations, and the United Nations is going to decide whether Jews can come to Israel. You tell me what would happen. Next, that recognition be accorded to the right of residents of Palestine, who, because of conditions created by the conflict there, have left their normal places of abode, to return to their homes without restriction and to regain possession of their property. By the way, no such concern for the Jews driven out of the Arab countries. Part 3 of the proposal, annexed to the suggestions. It is considered that certain territorial arrangements might be worthy of consideration. Again, he says might. This is what's going to happen. Inclusion of the whole or part of the Negev in Arab territory. Inclusion of the city of Jerusalem in Arab territory. But it's okay because the Arabs should protect the holy places of the Jews, because we know the Arabs are going to do that. The status of Yaffo, which is part of Tel Aviv, perhaps should go, let's leave that open. Perhaps Yaffo should be Arab. Haifa should be a free port, not under Israel. What became Ben Gurion Airport should be a free airport. The Lechi took a look at this. They knew what he was up to, and Yitzchak Shamir decided he gave the order to assassinate Count Folke Bernadotte. Again, here's your maps. We've been looking at it again and again. The original Palestine, 1922, we were left with the purple. 1947, we're left with the orange. And Count Folke Bernadotte, this was what we came out of the war. Bernadotte took this away. Bernadotte's plan took all of this away from Israel, leaving Israel with this. He gave Israel this. He took away this. He gave Israel this. He made Jerusalem Arab. He made Haifa internationalized a port. He made Lod Airport internationalized. That's what Israel would have been left with. And to this, 300,000 Arabs should be brought in to live there. And that's the answer. Let's take a look at some film now.
Count Folke Bernadotte.
In May 1948, Swedish diplomat Count Folke Bernadotte was appointed as UN mediator in Palestine. His mission was to seek a peaceful settlement.
And I believe, and I think I have the right to believe, that we sooner or later, it might be sooner, can get a settlement and stop the war in Palestine.
Count Bernadotte surveyed the devastated Palestinian villages and visited refugee camps in both Palestine and Jordan. The scale of the humanitarian disaster became apparent. He witnessed cramped living conditions, long queues for basic food, and scarce medical aid.
Again, whose fault is that? Whose fault is that? If you go to a house and you see children walking around in torn clothes or naked with their bones sticking out of their stomach, they're so starved. Are the parents at fault? Everybody would say the parents are at fault. Jews, 800,000, 650,000 came to Israel, integrated into the country. 300 to 600,000 Arabs fled into Jordan, had no business leaving. They chose of their own volition. And instead of being integrated into their countries, they were put on display, what you're looking at. Obviously, this is not a Zionist clip I picked up, but this is what I found. So they're being put on display. Look how terrible their conditions are. They have to be allowed back in. We're not going to let anything left. We're leaving them in starvation. Look at their circumstances. Imagine if Israel had done that with the 650,000 Sephardic Jews that came in.
The Count was no stranger to human disaster. With the Red Cross, he had rescued over 30,000 prisoners of war from Nazi concentration camps.
400 Jews.
He advocated the Palestinians' right to return to their homes. In a report dated 16 September 1948, he wrote, "It would be an offense against the principles of elementary justice if these innocent victims were denied the right to return to their homes, while Jewish immigrants flow into Palestine, and indeed at least offer the threat of permanent replacement of the Arab refugees who have been rooted in the land for centuries." The Count's first proposal argued for fixed boundaries through negotiation, an economic union between both states, and the return of Palestinian refugees. The proposal was turned down.
I hope that I will continue.
You know who turned it down? The Arabs turned it down because it still allowed for a Jewish state. So even with the 300,000 to come back and Jerusalem, and the Arabs still turned it down. Ben Gurion and the Labor Party, they were ready to negotiate. And Shamir knew once you let Ben Gurion start negotiating, he gives everything up. That's the history of the last 50 years, from 1917 for 30 years. They kept giving everything up and agreeing to compromise and compromise. And Shamir decided, this guy, Volker Bernadotte, he's not putting this thing forward. We'll stop him. You'll notice and remember what Bernadotte was saying, that how unjust it is that the Palestinians have been there for centuries and centuries, how unjust to have Jewish immigration taking place, while the poor Palestinians.
My mission as mediator for Palestine, that's what we hope to. And this is now a setback. We had, I would like to say, success in the beginning. It goes up and down. Now we are a little down, but I'm not at all a broken man over this. But I'm still hopeful that we can get a result of the mission.
كنت قاعد بمقر قيادة الجيش، يعني الكتيبة إلها قيادة، والقيادة كانت في الروضة، اسم المكان اسمه الروضة، وقاعدين هناك وإذ بيجي تلفون. Mr. Ipsis, نعم, we have a message for you. قلت له من مين؟ أنا من كوماندر ستافورد. قلت له شو هي؟ قال لي تعال. رحت عليهم رأسا لا أقول لك قلت بدنا نتنقتل.
On September the 17th, 1948, the day following his UN report, the motorcade of Count Bernadotte was ambushed in Jerusalem. He was shot at point-blank range by members of the Jewish Stern Gang.
Palestine, and from Jerusalem, the bodies of Count Bernadotte and the French truce observer Colonel Serrault are conveyed by ambulance to Haifa. Guards of honor pay homage to the man whose murder by Stern Gang terrorists shocked the world. Humanity is the poorer for the loss of Count Bernadotte, whose work for peace in Palestine had won the admiration of all civilized peoples.
The 300,000 Arabs never came back to Israel. Jerusalem emerged as part of Israel. The Negev emerged as part of Israel. Lod Airport became Ben Gurion Airport in Israel. Haifa Harbor became open to Jewish immigration to Israel. The country of Israel thrived and grew stronger despite Bernadotte and the United Nations. The people who assassinated Bernadotte eventually were located and identified, and they were pardoned by the state of Israel. The person who gave the order to assassinate Bernadotte became Prime Minister of Israel with postage stamps. And these are heroes, just as the people who assassinated Lord Moyne. And it is because of those actions that might not sound nice. And you see how the British film calls it. Your first giveaway is when they refer to the Stern Gang. Nobody ever called the PLO the Arafat Gang. You ever hear that term, the Arafat Gang? Nope. Hamas, they don't call them a gang. Hezbollah, only Lechi, Lochamei Cherut Yisrael. When they talk about how Folk Bernadotte, all civilized people in the world today, they talk about a two-state solution. It took, that's what the world is. If you want to survive, that's what it takes. In Israel today, we're going to be closing up today's class. In fact, with a clip that one of our students, one of those who participates regularly, Leslie Newman, sent me. Today there is a state of Israel and an Israel Defense Force and army, and there's a prayer for the state of Israel. Perhaps your synagogue or temple recites it on Shabbat in davening, and there's a melody to it that most people don't know. And we'll conclude today with the prayer for the state of Israel's armed forces and their well-being, and those who fight and risk their lives and are prepared to kill the enemy. No kind of like false humanity about, well, you can't kill certain people if they're out to destroy you. That's what it takes to have a country. So we'll conclude today with the prayer for the peace of Israel. And next week, we're going to continue beyond the rise of the Irgun. We're going to continue the rise of the state of Israel.
אברהם, יצחק ויעקב, הוא יברך את חיילי צבא ההגנה לישראל, הוא יברך את חיילי ארצנו וערי אלוהינו מן הלבנון ועד מדבר מצרים ומן הים הגדול עד לבוא הערבה ביבשה ייתן אדוני את אויבינו הקמים עלינו ניגפים לפניהם. הקדוש ברוך הוא ישמור ויציל את חיילינו מכל צרה וצוקה ומכל נגע ומחלה, וישלח ברכה והצלחה בכל מעשה ידיהם. ידבר שונאינו תחתיהם, ויעטרם בכתר ישועה ובעטרת ניצחון, ויקוים בהם הכתוב, כי אדוני אלוהיכם ההולך עמכם להילחם לכם עם אויביכם להושיע אתכם ונאמר
Thank you so very much for being here today, and we look forward to seeing you again next Sunday. We're going to take it beyond, as I said, the rise of the Machtar at the underground, and we're going to start looking at some of the other events in the founding of the State of Israel. Because today is June 11, I want to also wish a happy birthday to someone who's not here and probably won't see this for a number of years. My grandson Shmuel, whose birthday is 9 years old today. What may happen 5-10 years from now, one day he may be on YouTube searching and Googling and find out that his grandfather once was teaching classes of this nature. So I don't want him to think that we forgot his birthday, even though he may not know about it for about 5 or 10 years till he's deciding to follow things like this, which also lets you know that it is my plan to post all of these classes on YouTube sometime in the next month or two. Thanks so much for being here. God willing, on Tuesday, we'll continue with the story of David and Goliath, and post-Goliath and Shmuel Aleph, 1 Samuel, chapter 17 and 18.